In this edition of the Bucs Report, Kyle Trask will be given his opportunity. Is he the right choice as QB for your Tampa Bay Buccaneers? And then Dave Canales is the new offensive coordinator. Was that the best option, or was that all that was available? We'll talk about all of that and much more next on this edition of the Bucs Report. Let's go! Well, hello and welcome into this edition of the Bucs Report. I'm so glad you decided to join me today. As always, this podcast is free and available on all the major platforms. You can find it on the Bucs Report. Check it out online, bucsreport.com. You can find it on YouTube. Just search for the Bucs Report. And of course, you can find this audio podcast wherever you find your audio podcasts. My name is Dan Holme. You can find me on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Bucs Minutecast. So in this edition of the Bucs Report, we talk about how the Buccaneers have finally found their offensive coordinator in Dave Canales. He was the quarterback coach in Seattle. Is that ultimately the right choice for the Buccaneers, or was that the only option available? We'll talk about that in the show. Then we will talk about how there is more and more rumor spreading out there that Kyle Trask will be the number one quarterback, or at least he will be given the shot to be the number one quarterback. And then to close out the show, we're going to talk about what free agents should the Bucs prioritize. We know that there's a lot of names out there. How many of those players are going to want to come back to this team now that Tom Brady's not the quarterback? But just to get it going here, the Bucs have finally named their offensive coordinator, Dave Canales, who's the quarterback's coach in Seattle. What I've seen of him, when I watched his press conference, is a lot of energy. The questionable thing for me about Dave Canales is the fact that he doesn't have any offensive coordinator experience. And I guess there's no way of getting experience unless you just do it. But, do you really want to cut your teeth or get your experience for the first time in the NFL? That is an interesting question. What are some of the different offensive coordinators we know? We know Bieniemy was one of the options. We knew that Dan Pitcher was one of the other options. But ultimately, we know that Bieniemy went to Washington, and we know that Dan Pitcher stayed in with the Bengals. So, they did interview, I want to say 10 different candidates, but they landed on Dave Canales. And, from outward appearances, it does seem like he is a good candidate. Again, high energy. I'm going to be interested to see how he utilizes different players out there, like Rachaad White, for example. We know that the run game for the Bucs this last season was lacking a little bit. And some could point to the fact that it was because of Byron Leftwich's predictable play calling. And a lot of this is Monday morning quarterbacking. I understand now that we're getting further and further removed from the season. It's easy to kind of look back on it and say, I would have done this different, or I would have done that different. But the fact of the matter remains is the Bucs went all in with Todd Bowles and Byron Leftwich with the last season of Tom Brady on the Bucs. Was it the right decision? And, I've spoke about that on this podcast, my other podcast, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers Minutecast, about why did the Buccaneers squander the last season of Tom Brady in the NFL with inexperience? And it's something that is going to have to be answered. And, to a certain extent, I think that Jason Light, he is going to be under the gun by the Glazers. I think at the end of the day, why didn't he do more? Why didn't he go out and get another candidate? And I know that a lot of people are saying, well, with Bruce Arians, he kind of all of a sudden said that I'm not going to be the coach this year. And they didn't really want to go out and vet anyone or find anyone else. So they were content with going with Todd Bowles. A bit of an interesting move out there. But, the Buccaneers are all in. with him, and it's going to remain to be seen if it was the right decision to make. And I guess we really won't know. New Bucs offensive coordinator Dave Canales says he is excited to bring a new look to what the Bucs are doing on offense. Canales says he really liked Kyle Trask coming out of college, says the Bucs are going to help him be a point guard who can succeed by distributing to very good skill position players, says it is a quarterback friendly offense. And one of the interesting things that I've heard about Dave Canales is the fact that he has never met Trask yet. He doesn't have a whole lot of knowledge, but on day one in his press conference, he felt confident in what they had in Kyle Trask. And from what I'm hearing out there, he is basing that almost solely on the fact of what he learned from his staff around him. So he is saying, well, they're vouching for him, and I'm going to say that he's going to be a good candidate as well. So that is the biggest question remaining for the Bucs right now, is who is going to be the QB for your Tampa Bay Buccaneers next year. I know that it's my assessment that they will most likely go out there and it'll be Kyle Trask and probably some grizzled old veteran, or maybe it's going to be, I don't know. There's Heineke. I've heard all kinds of different names out there. Baker Mayfield. Baker Mayfield, is that really a good option for the Bucs? We saw him struggle with the different teams that he played on. Some could point to the fact, when he was playing on the Browns, he was playing on a deplorable team. Can we really accurately, judge what kind of quarterback Baker Mayfield is for the fact that he played on the Browns? A lot of tough questions for the Bucs going forward. And ultimately, who is going to be the QB? And why is that such of big impact? Is because it creates quite a vacuum. You go from having Jameis Winston. Well, let's face it, we knew what we had in Jameis Winston. It was kind of lacking in the luster department, if you will, to going to Tom Brady, the greatest of all time, to now fill in the blank. Who is it going to be? Question mark. And the bar has been set very high for whoever that next quarterback is. I've heard different podcasts and stuff out there. They're going to say, get used to there not being as many more primetime games. Get used to them being, maybe more 3:00 in the afternoon start times, that kind of thing, because a lot of questions now remain about, now that a lot of these big players potentially could move on. We know that Brady, for example, he kept a lot of those players here. He kept them coming back. How many of them will want to come back? And I think that a lot of the questions that potential players, when they come to this team, is they're going to want to know, who is my QB going to be? Especially, if it's a receiver, a running back, something of that nature. They're going to want to know who that is. And, I think that they started in the first process was by finally naming their offensive coordinator, by hiring Dave Canales. And, a lot of it, for me, being that there's not a huge track record there with him, is just kind of crossing your fingers and toes and hoping for the best. Let's hope that he is the right candidate for the job. So it is a tough thing for the Buccaneers as they kind of chart uncharted waters here. It's been a while, the last few years here, we had Tom Brady and there was a lot of certainty. Now they're, kind of lacking that, ultimately what they're going to have in the tank going forward. And, the interesting thing for me is, like I talked about off the top, is how is he going to utilize the different running backs? How is he going to utilize Rachaad White? Is Leonard Fournette going to come back? I hear more and more chatter out there that Leonard Fournette is probably going to move on to another team. I know his contract isn't up. It's just this team is kind of in crunch time now because there's that dead cap space that Tom Brady left behind. So it is kind of putting the Bucs in a tough position going forward as to how to proceed and, what is the future, and I think that, once they can finally solidify and say who their number one QB is going to be, that is going to make it a lot easier going forward. But that is the question that they're going to have to answer before I think you can kind of put a team together, because no one's going to want to come to a team that is like, well, I guess that's what it's going to be. What we ultimately don't know. All right. So after the break here, we are going to talk about what free agents should the Buccaneers prioritize. I've heard a lot of different rumors and gossip, mostly gossip and memes out there, that Mike Evans is going to head to the Chicago Bears. And I hear that, Godwin may have played his last game with the Buccaneers. It's all crazy talk, if you ask me. And we'll talk about it next. All right, welcome back into this edition of the Bucs Report. I'm so glad you decided to join me today. In this next segment here, we are going to talk about potential free agent quarterbacks and which one would be well suited to play on your Buccaneers. That is the biggest question. They got the first hurdle out of the way. They named their offensive coordinator. Now they need to solidify that QB position. That is of paramount importance. And if it happens to be Kyle Trask, I mean, ultimately, I'm all in on that. I mean, I have just a brief snippet to see what he has in the tank in real game situations. He played briefly this last season. It wasn't enough to really determine, I guess I would say, what kind of quarterback he's going to be. I know that he finished in the top of his draft or near the top of his draft. I want to say there was only 4 other quarterbacks named in front of him. So he does have the potential to be the next great thing. But the tough thing about being a quarterback, a backup quarterback, a third string quarterback, is that you don't get a lot of playing time. Sometimes the backup doesn't get a lot of playing time. I kind of draw lines and comparisons to a backup goalie in the NHL, but if you take a look at it in that instance, even a backup goalie gets a lot more playing time than, a second or third string quarterback. And in a lot of ways, it's like you have one opportunity to prove yourself or, that's it. That's all she wrote for you. So, I mean, the expectation and, the bar is set very high on what a quarterback is going to have to be. But taking a look out there at a lot of the different options, like we talked about, Baker Mayfield out there. I've heard Teddy Bridgewater. I've heard different names out there that would be a good option on this team. I've also heard Taylor Heineke out there. I think that he has shown some flashes of greatness as well. But just taking a look at the list out there, there is, quite a substantial list that is out there for different quarterbacks to come to this team. It's ultimately going to be determined on who decides to come here, because there is that tough aspect of it is, am I going to want to come to this team and who is going to be my weapons? What's going to be at my disposal? There was this story here in the Tampa Bay Times. They said Kyle Trask will get his shot to be the Bucs starting quarterback. He has waited without a complaint or complacency for 2 seasons and has earned this opportunity. That's what the Bucs told at least several candidates who interviewed for the offensive coordinator job that went to Seahawks Dave Canales. But they also said they plan to add a veteran or 2 to complete with the former Florida Gators star. And, one of the things that I've heard some people talk about, well, they had Gabbert. Why didn't they just have it be a shootout with Gabbert and Trask? I don't think that Gabbert is the future at the QB position for the Bucs. So I think that would just be a waste of time. For one thing, he's not under contract anymore, so they would have to re-sign him to a new deal. And I think at this point of Gabbert's career, he kind of knows, and I kind of know, and I think all the Bucs fans know out there what he has. He is a really solid backup, and I have no doubt in my mind that he could get a backup job somewhere in the NFL. But, for him to be a starter on this Bucs team and to expect that they're going to make any kind of big push, I think is short-sighted and I think a bit foolish at the end of the day. But it's interesting that it seems like it's Kyle Trask's job for the taking, or that is what the different articles out here are saying. If that ultimately remains to be seen, if that is what's going to happen. But I do think that, like I say, it's his job to lose. And I think that, that's on him. Is he going to want to pursue it? Does he think that he has what it takes to be the number 1 QB? It's important to note that Tampa Bay drafted Trask with the final pick in the second round of the 2021 NFL draft. Only the Jaguars, Trevor Lawrence, Jets, Zach Wilson, and 49ers, Trey Lance, taken with the first 3 picks, and the Patriots, Mac Jones, number 15 overall, went ahead of him. Trask has been the heir apparent to Tom Brady, but couldn't win the number 2 job with Blaine Gabbert last training camp. And, I think to a certain extent that was some reluctance to go with the young guy. You notice that in all of sports, really, is that there's this reluctance to go with an unproven commodity. And I think the Bucs are in a position now, just based on Brady's dead cap space that he left behind, that they're going to have to go with Trask and maybe, an older veteran out there because they don't have a ton of money to spend. And in particular, how much money they have to spend there was a figure out here that they were talking about exactly what is left, projected to be 55.3 million over the salary cap, the second fewest cap space in the NFL. That, like they talked about here, one quarterback under contract, Kyle Trask. So it is an interesting thing. They are already over, and then the questions kind of draw into focus is who are they going to bring back to this team? We know that Levante David is one of the ones, Jamel Dean. Which one of those are they going to prioritize? And I'll talk about that a little bit later in the show. But it is interesting, and it's a tough position to put the Bucs in here. Nonetheless, the NFC South at the moment is currently fresh out of franchise quarterback, so there's no reason to not let Trask try to see what he can do in a Canales quarterback-friendly scheme. Canales believes his system doesn't require a quarterback to have the most size, strongest arm, or quickest feet. Trask is, however, 6'5", 236 pounds, with only adequate arm strength and functional mobility within the pocket. He's worked hard to lean out and prove his heavy feet, but he's only completed 58.4% of his passes in preseason with 2 touchdowns and 4 interceptions. He went 3 for 9 for 23 yards in his only regular season appearance January 8th at Atlanta. So his accuracy must improve. And that's kind of what I'm talking about here, is the zero margin for error. He had one moment to prove himself to the Bucs fans, the beat writers, Rick Stroud in this case, and they're already saying he's got to work on his accuracy if he wants to find a job on this team. That was his only opportunity in a real game, regular season game in the NFL, and people are already saying, you better clean it up. That is a really high bar to set for anyone, is that you better be ready. So, the tough thing about that is constantly being prepared. I know he works, like with the practice squad or gets extra reps that way, but it's not real world experience. So I think that I'm going to give Kyle Trask the benefit of the doubt. Why wouldn't you want to do that? I've heard some people say that maybe they're going to go out and draft another quarterback. And I'm thinking, you don't even know what you have in the first quarterback that you drafted. Why would you want to go out and draft someone else? It seems a bit ridiculous to me. And the thing that I like about it is it seems that Canales is all in on having Kyle Trask get his opportunity out there. It's a style of play. Canales said, if I go back to the University of Southern California for a bit, you just start rattling off quarterbacks that came out from there, going back to Carson Palmer. You had Matt Leinart, and that goes to John David Booty. Then Mark Sanchez. Matt Barkley falls into that category as well. One guy, the other, highly touted, gets a lot of accolades. So it is an interesting thing going forward for the Bucs that, what are they going to end up doing to finally solidify that role, to finally, have that number one quarterback. And once they can establish who that number one quarterback is, then I think for me, they can kind of fan out and take care of the free agents. But for me, the next step, like I said, they have the offensive coordinator thing locked down. Next thing is to have, what is the competition going to be? They're saying that there could be a potential of 3 different quarterbacks, Trask plus. Who are those going to be? That is the question that's going to have to be answered. All right, so after the break here, we're going to talk about pending free agents on the Buccaneers and which ones can we expect to come back and how this next season is shaping up to be with the new offensive coordinator. We'll talk about that next. All right, welcome back into this edition of the Bucs Report. I'm so glad you decided to join me in this episode. In the next segment, we're going to talk about free agents and which ones we could see potentially coming back and which ones potentially played their last game for the Bucs. It is a tough position for the Bucs to kind of move forward unless they have solidified certain positions. So, we take a look at free agents out there, and the biggest free agents on the list, just kind of taking a look at it briefly, is Levante David, Jamel Dean, Sean Murphy-Bunting, Anthony Nelson, Mike Edwards, Akeem Hicks, and there is quite a substantial list after that. It is my belief that they should give Levante David whatever he asks for. I think that he's earned it, and he plays such a huge role on this team. Same goes for Jamel Dean, because if you take a look at it, if you are minus those players, then you're going to have to go out and try to plug those holes with other players that probably aren't going to be as good. What I talked about in the last segment is it puts the Bucs in a tough position because they have very little to no cap space. They're going to have to move on from some pieces. Some of those players are going to have a spot on this team. It's going to be up to Jason Light and the Glazers ultimately, I guess, to determine who's going to come back. I'm sure that Todd Bowles will have his say in it to an extent as well. But I think to a certain extent it also puts Bowles in a good position because he can finally put his stamp of approval on a lot of these different coaches that are coming in. And you had to think that he had his say, at least in part, about having Canales come here and be the offensive coordinator. I think there were probably other suitors out there that for his services, but ultimately he chose the Bucs, and I'm glad ultimately that he did. Because again, he has that high energy. It's just going to be interesting to see how that translates into his job moving forward here. So that's what I would say. Levante David, Jamel Dean, and Sean Murphy Bunting, the corner position. You take a look at it. The whole team struggled last season, suffices to say, and that was kind of all started with the Ryan Jensen injury. And then it kind of just spiraled out of control after that. So I think that once they get some of those key pieces locked up, I think it'll put the Bucs in a good position going forward. It's just a matter of determining who your starting quarterback is going to be, and then determining what of these other players are going to come back. Are they going to be able to get a hometown discount? It's my belief that, you have such a limited window in the NFL that why would you want to waste it playing on a team just because it's the team you're comfortable with? If I was an NFL player right now today, I would go wherever they're going to pay me the most money. And I know that some people would probably say, well, that's not, any real great team loyalty. Hey, it's the nature of the beast. You could get traded anyway. What we know about an NFL player is their career is pretty short. So I would try to make as much money as I possibly could, knowing that my career in the NFL is going to be fairly short. So that's my take on it. And, you take a look at it, you got to think to a certain extent, that's what Levante David's thinking. You got to think that's what Jamel Dean's thinking. I know that there is a good chemistry out there between a lot of those different players. And are they willing to look past that, to work on and play on a different team? That's the tough question going forward, but it doesn't really help that, there's that dead cap space, that dead cap money that was left behind when Brady decided to retire. And we ultimately knew that the writing was on the walls, that was going to happen. But again, it's just a tough thing now is to see what is this team going to look like. There's a certain bar and expectation out there of what this Bucs team is going to be. And, if you take a look at it, they won a Super Bowl not too many years ago, a couple of years ago here. That's the expectation. That is the bar, is winning a Super Bowl. But it's going to be that much more difficult when you don't have Brady at the helm. You have this unproven commodity, whether it be Kyle Trask or Heineke or Baker Mayfield or whoever the case may be. Are any of those, the Bucs struggled last season with the greatest of all time at the QB. How do you think they're going to do with less than that? I think that to a certain extent, Bucs fans are going to have to get used to the fact that it's going to be some lean years out there. It's not going to probably be a Super Bowl season next year. Now, I could be wrong, and I would love to be wrong and have them go to the Super Bowl and win a Super Bowl. It just doesn't seem like that's in the cards. I think that this team is in the middle of a rebuild or a retool or whatever kind of word you want to use about it. I just don't think it's going to be a plug and play. I don't think that it's going to be Baker Mayfield and Kyle Trask, and that's going to be the tandem that's going to take them to the Super Bowl. I just really don't think that that's going to be the case. And then if you take a look at it, the players that could potentially move on from this team, so many different things get drawn into question here. So it is going to be kind of waiting and seeing who's going to be here. Now, you take a look at it, that Jason Light, he could go out and sign someone that could be a grand slam, knock it out of the park. Like, I didn't see that coming. Maybe he could make a trade and get a really big name quarterback on this team. Because it just seems to me that it doesn't seem to fit the MO of the Bucs to kind of go all in on Kyle Trask right now. I understand that they're way over the cap, and that kind of limits their flexibility. Maybe that means they're going to have to move on from some of the bigger players that are out there to get that number one quarterback out there, because that, at the end of the day, your team rises and falls for the most part with the QB. Now, you could say that it's also the receivers and the running back, but you have to have the great quarterback to hand off the football or make that really great pass, or it's going to be really tough sledding going forward. All right, once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of the Bucs Report. Just some good news here. Ultimately, I'm so glad that the Bucs finally found their offensive coordinator. They can at least mark that off the list of things that they need to worry about. Next for me, of course, is the QB and who that's going to ultimately end up being. So once again, thank you for joining me on this edition of the Bucs Report, where it's Buccaneers talk 24/7, 365. I'll talk to you guys again next week.